There are numerous cases where people have developed amnesia and totally forgotten who they are, but few are as mysterious as the case of Charles Jamison. Let's investigate. If you enjoy internet mysteries, conspiracies, and true crime, feel free to subscribe and turn on notifications for more content like this. I also have a Patreon and a PayPal, so if you're interested in supporting the channel, feel free to check those out, links will be in the description. In February 1945, an ambulance arrived at the emergency entrance of Boston's US Public Health Service hospital. The patient was a man who was unconscious and seriously injured, with what looked to be shrapnel wounds around his body and various other seeping sores. There was a 2-inch scar on his right cheek, and the index finger on his left hand was missing. He was middle-aged with greying hair, probably around late 50s to early 60s, not the hospital's usual type of patient. The ambulance driver didn't seem to know much about this man other than that his name was Charles Jamison, a detail supported by a medical or identity tag that was present on him according to some sources. It was touch and go for a while whether he'd survive. He had a bone marrow infection and needed treatment for weeks. The infection sadly left him paralysed from the waist down, though doctors did at least manage to save his life. Now that he was out of the woods, staff turned their attention to trying to figure out who this man was and where he came from, a task that would prove very difficult. He was suffering from severe amnesia and a significant speech impediment, which made the very few things he did say hard to understand, though he seemed to agree that his name was Charles Jamison. The labels had been cut out of all of his clothes. He did have a few tattoos, which initially seemed like promising clues, but were likely red herrings. There were hearts and various flags, including the American and British flags, and also a faded tattoo that said US Navy. Just from the tattoos, you could surmise that Charles was probably American, or maybe British, and had served in the US Navy. If he had served in the Navy, there would be records of this, but there were none. His fingerprints didn't match any databases, and despite his distinctive appearance, no one recognised him when his photo was sent to Navy personnel, or even when it was shared by missing persons organisations. The case was mentioned in newspapers around the country, yet no one came forward or called the hospital to identify or claim him. What was even more bizarre though, the ambulance that had dropped him off in the first place had seemingly vanished into thin air. It wasn't even known where it came from to begin with, as it didn't come from this hospital, and none of the other dispatchers reported sending that ambulance. The driver has never been identified or located either. It was like he and the ambulance just disappeared as suddenly as Charles seemed to appear. For 8 years, Charles remained at the hospital, making barely any progress, with his real identity still unknown. He spent his days in a wheelchair, rarely ever making a noise, and not seeming to pay much attention to the world around him. Then in 1953, Oliver Williams became the new medical director at the hospital and made it his goal to figure out who Charles really was. He created a simple game where Charles was given a phrase, a question or a photo and was asked if it had any meaning to him. Some details were learnt through this game, though it's hard to place any weight in any information that Charles gave himself. His amnesia, paired with other probable mental illnesses, didn't exactly make him the most reliable source. He claimed he was 49 years old, and I'm not sure if they ever determined his actual age, but he looked a lot older than 49 when he first arrived at the hospital, let alone 8 years later. Perhaps he was 49 when his amnesia first developed, whether that was years earlier, or it might have even been when he arrived at the hospital and he just looked a lot older than he really was. It seemed that he had a wife, or at least he thought he had a wife, as his eyes lit up when he was asked how old his wife was, but he couldn't remember. He was able to name 2 British statesmen, thinking they were still alive, even though they'd been dead for a long time at this point. Gaining information through this method was a slow process, though Charles eventually managed to remember that he was from London, lived in a grey house, had no living relatives, and had been in the British Navy since he was 13 years old. He claimed that he served on a ship called the Bellerophon during World War I, though the British Navy could find no record of a Charles Jamison serving around that time. He also claimed to have served on a ship called the Cutty Sark, though it turned out that that ship had been decommissioned for 50 years. He mentioned serving on a New Zealand ship too, though the New Zealand Navy had no record of him either. He spoke about being involved in top-secret missions, though refused to give any specific details, even when he was reminded that the war had ended a long time ago. Eventually, a potential lead emerged, which ended up resulting in more questions than answers. A Charles William Jamison, aged 49, was found on the manifest of a US Navy ship, which had docked in Boston just 2 days before Charles arrived at the hospital. Staff had already contacted the Navy, who couldn't find any record of him, though I'm not sure if something was missed. According to the documents, Charles spent 4 years in a German prisoner of war camp before returning to the UK. He was a sailor on a British vessel named the Cutty Sark, which is the name of a ship he'd mentioned before, the one that they thought had been decommissioned for 50 years. The ship ended up getting torpedoed, and that's when he was picked up by the US transport ship a couple of weeks before he arrived at the hospital in Boston. The manifest listed his birthplace as Boston, but I'm not really sure if that's Boston in America, where the hospital is located, or Boston in the UK, where some sources imply Charles is from. Anyway, this new information initially seemed like a huge breakthrough. It was the first time they'd found any confirmation that a Charles Jamison matching this man's description even existed. His name, age, and even the name of the ship matched what Charles had recalled previously, but oddly, all the information on Charles was handwritten in ink, despite the rest of the document being typed up. It was a lead, but they'd need to find something more solid to corroborate this information, so the next logical step was to start checking birth records and other records. Though records showed that no Charles William Jamison had been born in Boston between 1885 and 1905, and no one by that name had been made a naturalised citizen. There was a Charles Jamison who had been born in Illinois in 1908, but there was next to no information about him, and Charles had no recollection of ever even visiting Illinois, let alone being born there. So this couldn't really be investigated fully, but it does seem a very unlikely match considering the birth date being 1908. Charles looks significantly older than that. No one who was supposedly on the ship with Charles recognised his name or any photos of him, and they had no idea who had handwritten the information on him either. New Zealand authorities contacted the hospital after they realised Charles's description sounded identical to a crew member named James Jennings on a ship called Hinamoa, which Charles had mentioned being a crew member on before. Information he had given about the ship turned out to be true, though he didn't seem to believe that he was James Jennings, and the freighter's crew list didn't mention Charles Jamison or anyone matching his description. Another potential lead emerged when someone heard about Charles and noticed that he looked very similar to their father-in-law, Frank Higgins. Frank was a chief engineer who was sailing a cargo ship when he and the ship disappeared in December 1942. Unfortunately, the two men's fingerprints didn't match, leaving two separate mysteries to remain unsolved. Sadly, after living at the hospital for nearly 30 years, Charles died, with no one, including himself, any wiser as to who he really was. Someone commented on a web sleuths thread referencing an article they found on Ancestry.com which reported that Charles had been identified in 1957 as James Hamilton. It said that he was identified by his sister, Frances Hamilton, who apparently hoped to make arrangements to move her brother to California, where she lived. I honestly have no idea if that's true or not. I couldn't find any other mention of it online, and all the articles I read about this state that Charles' real identity was never discovered. It was suggested on the thread that Francis might have been a fraud, which seems likely considering Charles never was moved to California and by all accounts died at the hospital. There are a number of theories, some of which are pretty out there, such as that he was from a parallel universe or that he was a ghost. I don't really believe in that stuff, but hearing stories like this, it kind of does make you wonder. It's almost like he just never existed until he appeared at that hospital, and it's so strange that the ambulance and its driver have never been seen since either. I'm not sure if they genuinely disappeared, or if no one took much notice at the time and the driver just never bothered coming forward. What's so interesting and bizarre about this case is that you just don't know what, if anything, that Charles said was actually true. I wonder if he ever really was in the Navy, or if it was all just a fantasy and the details that he revealed painted a picture of the life that he wanted to have. That would explain why they couldn't find any proper records of him, because they were totally barking up the wrong tree. Even just them thinking that he was in the Navy when he wasn't could have seriously hindered the chances of identifying him, but we don't know that anything else that he said was true either. Maybe he had a fascination with the Navy and read loads of books on it, or possibly even knew people that were in the army themselves and just learnt loads of stories from them. That would make sense, considering some of the stories and the details that he told about the ships actually turned out to be true, and he also seemed to have some level of general knowledge about the Navy. As for the handwritten document on the Cutty Sark, I wonder if he was actually on that ship. Maybe he just snuck on and wrote those notes himself to give his story some credibility. That would suggest that this was all a hoax on his part though, and that he was intentionally trying to conceal his identity, as opposed to genuinely suffering amnesia and not being able to remember who he is. I wouldn't rule that out, but if that is the case, I wonder what he was hiding from. He spent nearly 30 years in that hospital. At least some of those years were spent not really communicating with anyone or even paying any attention to the world around him. It doesn't sound like a particularly nice life. He would have to be a very good actor to fake the amnesia, and whatever was his reason for not wanting to be identified must have had worse consequences than his life at the hospital. Maybe he was a spy and knew he'd be arrested, or worse, or maybe he committed another serious crime and pretended to be mentally ill to avoid prison. This theory doesn't explain the vanishing ambulance and driver though. The way Charles was dropped off seems to imply that the driver didn't want anyone asking too many questions, and that he tried to leave as soon as possible, leaving them only with the name Charles Jamison. Surely he must have known something else, at least where he picked Charles up from or what had happened. The situation makes more sense if the driver was actively trying to conceal where he came from, and perhaps Charles's identity in general. But why would he do that? Had he or someone else caused Charles to be in the situation he was in? I considered the possibility that Charles really was in the Navy and really did work on some top secret missions. Maybe he was experimented on or tortured for information, though I don't know why they wouldn't just kill him rather than dropping him off at a hospital after. They could have gotten rid of all of his records though, explaining why no one could have identified him. There are so many possibilities, but most just feels like wild speculation, because there's next to no information about Charles that has actually been confirmed. I guess there is a small chance that he somehow managed to just slip through the cracks, or they missed his records all that time, but that does seem very unlikely considering how long they tried to identify him for. The only things I'm fairly sure of is that whoever this man was, his name probably wasn't Charles Jamison, and whatever caused him to be in this situation wasn't good, whether it was his own mental illness or someone else's doing. I'd be interested to hear your thoughts in the comments. Do you have any theories that I didn't mention here? If you enjoyed the video, please consider liking and subscribing. Huge thank you to my patrons, whose names are on screen now. I really appreciate your support. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next Thursday in a new video.